The Blackwood was aptly named. Its trees had grown twisted and warped, their roots drawing upon an unearthly taint in the very soil, which turned their leaves black and greasy. The wildlife was not immune either. The good, the beautiful, and the innocent died of the taint's poison, while the dark, vicious, and savage flourished, and grew to immense size and strength. What remained was a nightmarish caricature of what had once been. At the edge, where the trees were still somewhat sparse and scattered, there was still some light to see by. The trees, however, standing the lonely guard of shadowy, jagged obelisks, turned the bright outskirts of the Blackwood into a surreal dreamscape. Further in still, as the trees grew taller and ever more ancient, their tentacle-like branches blotted out the light, bit by bit, until the wood became truly black. A single road led from the foot of the mount through the Blackwood and out into the brighter lands beyond. It was called the Warlock's Path, created by and maintained for the use of Thraxis himself. None walked that road except by the permission, or perhaps insistence, of the Warlock. To those welcome, it offered sanctuary and safe passage. To those who trespassed, however, it drew the attention of every denizen of the cursed forest. This is why, upon approaching the dreamlike shadowed plain, dotted with its warped wooden guardians, Dawn immediately strayed from the path.
This doesn't seem wise,
Elizabeth protested.
In every story I've ever read, the only way to survive a place like this was to stick to the beaten path.
Yeah,
Dawn agreed.
but see, you haven't read this story, not yet anyway. Trust me, I've been through these woods once already. The safest way is the path less taken.
Elizabeth chuckled, her mouth pulling into a contented smile. Dawn drew to a stop and threw Elizabeth a curious glance.
What?
You haven't changed a bit. It feels like just yesterday we were searching the gorge for monster.
Dawn paused and looked at the ground.
I wish that was true, Liz. I really wish it was.
Elizabeth drew up beside him, her smile fading into a look of immense concern.
Where have you been?
Dawn grunted and shrugged.
Looking for you, actually. I picked up your trail after the attack. Been following it ever since.
When he looked up at Elizabeth again, he wore a painfully weary expression.
It's been getting harder lately. I've been losing track of you a lot. It's like you just lift off and fly away.
That would be the scale.
Elizabeth explained.
I've met a brilliant rat. He designed a wind-powered vehicle so we could travel more quickly. It has a tendency to take off in flight when the wind picks up.
Elizabeth chuckled lightly, but stopped when she saw the look on Dawn's face. He was far from amused. He appeared, in fact, to be a little hurt.
You and this rat? You're not... Are you?
We're not what?
Elizabeth asked. Then it dawned on her.
No, of course not. He's a rat and I'm not.
Dawn grunted.
So, there hasn't been anyone else?
A somber look crossed Elizabeth's face.
His name was Adam.
Dawn nodded.
I see. I take it things didn't work out.
Elizabeth shut her eyes and shook her head.
He died.
Dawn flinched, taken aback. As he watched the pained look in her face, Dawn squeezed Elizabeth's shoulder.
Well, I'm sorry for your loss.
What about you?
Elizabeth asked. Dawn shrugged.
Well, there's been a few who wish they were, even one tagging along with us right now. But, no, I haven't been able to let go. Won't be able to until I catch up and, I don't know, find you with someone else or find out you just don't need me anymore.
Elizabeth's eyes grew wide and she shook her head emphatically.
No, of course I still need you. I love you. Dawn, if you had asked me to marry you, I would have. I still would.
Dawn looked at the ground and chuckled ruefully.
Yeah, of course. That's exactly what a dream would say.
He looked up with a faint smirk.
At least you're a nice dream.
Dream?
Elizabeth repeated. Dawn nodded.
Sure, a dream. Look around you, Liz. You don't think any of this is real, do you?
I'm real.
Elizabeth insisted.
If anyone's a dream around here, it's you.
Dawn smirked.
Right. A dream would also say that too.
I could say the same to you.
Elizabeth retorted.
And a dream would.
Dawn dropped to the ground in a small hollow between two tentacle-like roots.
What's the use? Fine then, you're real, I'm a dream.
Elizabeth smiled, faintly but warmly.
You are, you know, the dream. My dream.
Dawn looked up at her, his expression one of intense loss and longing. Yet as he saw Elizabeth's face, Dawn's mouth pulled into a faint smirk.
You too. Ever since I pulled into the edge of the gorge and saw you reading by the fire, you were my dream.
Elizabeth knelt down beside Dawn and rubbed his shoulder.
So, what do you plan to do now?
Dawn shrugged.
Enjoy the dream while it lasts? Snuggle up beside me and wait for the morning to take it all away?
Elizabeth chuckled, smiling as a veil welled across her eyes.
I think I'd rather enjoy the adventure and forget that morning will ever come.
Dawn chuckled.
You would say that, wouldn't you?
That's how you know I'm not a dream.
Ha! Whatever you say, dream girl.
Dawn stood up and dusted off the seat of his leggings.
I think that tree had termites anyway.
From amid the tangle of Elizabeth's hair, there came the sound of Wil and Chrissy clapping. Elizabeth glanced skyward and grinned.
Well, I'm glad you two approve.
We wouldn't miss it, Chrissy exclaimed. Wil shrugged. I might, but the Blackwood sounds cool.
We'll see about that,
Dawn muttered, and he led off, deeper into the wood. The trees closed in as they continued on. Walking became difficult as the trunks grew ever closer. In time, the challenge became simply finding a place to step amid the dense, dark labyrinth. All openings seemed to lead to the same place. When Dawn finally emerged onto the dark, narrow road, he sighed with dismay.
Well, this isn't pretty.
What is it?
Elizabeth asked, brushing away a few stray leaves from her hair.
The Warlock's Path.
Dawn turned back to Elizabeth and shook his head.
I had to hazard a guess. I'd say Old Thirsty controls the Blackwood, too.
He glanced in either direction. From his right, there came the distant pinprick of a tiny light, and from the left, a deep, terrible darkness.
Stay close and step lightly, Liz. This place is worse than the gorge.
Elizabeth drew close and took hold of Dawn's arm.
What if Wil and Chrissy provided some light?
Dawn shook his head.
That'd be like painting a giant bullseye on our backs. Everything for miles around would be drawn to it.
So we walk blindly?
Dawn nodded.
That's about the shape of it.
At least we can cuddle as we go.
Elizabeth mused. Dawn chuckled.
Yeah, now I know this is a dream. The realists would never say that.
Time can change a person.
Dawn looked into Elizabeth's face, a final time as the dark closed in around them.
Sure, but not that much.
All sight faded into memory as Dawn and Elizabeth crept quietly down the road. There was a musty, woody smell to the air, the smell of dead and dying trees. Dry leaves crunched underfoot. There were motions in the branches overhead.
Squirrels.
Elizabeth told herself.
Just squirrels.
Dawn gave her a warning nudge in the side.
Let's try to keep it quiet, eh? We don't want to attract any unwanted attention.
Do my ears deceive me? A voice cried out in the dark.
Like that.
People! Oh, finally! Real people! There came a heavy sound of shuffling as something rapidly approached. Where are you? I've been stumbling around in the dark for weeks.
Over here!
Elizabeth called. Dawn immediately slapped a hand over her mouth.
Quiet, Liz. You want everything in the woods to come for us? There's probably another Thrax's tricks.
Trick or not, it was too late. A small form crashed into and bounced off of Elizabeth's legs, dropping to the ground with a faint thud. That you, lady? Oh, thank God! I can kiss your feet. Think I will, too. Elizabeth felt a faint sucking sensation as a pair of tiny lips pressed against her toes. Wow, those are some real nice feet, too. Legs, too. Nice legs. The lips worked up to Elizabeth's shin, then her knee, and then she took a very uncomfortable step back, letting the little thing flop onto the ground in her absence.
Next time, listen to me,
Dawn muttered.
From now on,
Elizabeth agreed. Wow, y'all are big! A tiny finger flicked against Dawn's knee. Y'all didn't drop down no beanstalk to eat everybody, did ya?
I didn't.
Dawn answered.
I'm not so sure about her, though.
Elizabeth gave Dawn a warning nudge in the side.
No, we actually...
She paused, suddenly recognizing the voice.
Stu? Is that you?
My name's Stubbo Staggins, a stag end, expert treasure hunter extraordinaire. But, I just want to go home to my nice little hole.
What are you doing in the Blackwood?
Dawn piped up. I lost my dwarves. 13 of the biggest dummies y'all ever seen. It's like trying to lead around a pack of hyperactive, attention-deficit toddlers. Every time we start getting somewhere, they get distracted and scatter. I'm finished, I tell you. Finished. Stubbo paused a moment for breath. So, y'all know the way out of here?
You could go back the way we came,
Dawn offered.
but the path leads to the Tower of Thoraxis.
Ah, shoot, Stubbo spat. We were supposed to be miles south of there. According to Ganorf's map, the road was supposed to come out on the far side of the wood. There was a short pause. Y'all don't mind if I dig along with you? I'm kinda lost.
Of course we don't mind.
Elizabeth spoke up before Dawn could protest.
You're welcome to stay with us as long as you like.
Really? Stubbo's smile was almost audible in his tone. Wow, y'all are nice. I got lucky.
Wonderful.
Dawn grumbled. And don't y'all worry about protecting me. Old Stubbo's got a sword of his own. As if to drive the point home, Stubbo drew it from its sheath and held it aloft. The blade cast a bright blue glow that lit up their surroundings for a radius of several feet. Elizabeth could clearly see Stubbo in the soft illumination. A short, curly-haired, pot-bellied man with freakishly large, hairy feet and a deeply unsettled look on his face. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh?
Dawn repeated.
What do you mean, uh-oh?
Well, it only does that when something real bad's about to happen.
Does what?
Glows. The next sound was a frightened yelp from Elizabeth. Dawn whirled about, in time to see her lifted clear off the ground, a web-like lasso wrapped around her waist, tightly binding her arms to her sides. In the branches above, 8 black eyes shimmered in the faint light, a handful of black, multi-jointed limbs rapidly reeling in the lasso as if it had caught a fish. Quick as a flash, Dawn whipped out one of his daggers and flung it just over Elizabeth's head. The webbing cut. She dropped to the ground with a loud thud. It's okay, Stubbo shouted. I can fix this. With that, he sheathed his sword, plunging them all into pitch darkness. There, now they can't see us. As if to refute Stubbo's claim, a pair of smaller spiders descended from the branches, took hold of him, and then bounced back up like a couple of bungee jumpers. Whoops, guess they can. Dawn, however, put up more of a fight. He listened, carefully, both to the sounds around him and to his own instincts. Several times, silken nooses were lowered about his neck, only to be cut the moment he felt them. A few other times, larger spiders dropped down, attempting to grab him in their limbs, only for those limbs to be cut off. Eventually, however, a small, stealthy spider managed to bite him in the back of his leg, and then scurried away into the dark before Dawn could stab it. His struggles grew slower, weaker, and as the venom coursed through his veins, they eventually stopped altogether. Paralyzed with the numbing agents, Dawn finally collapsed to the ground, and was cautiously drawn into the branches.
Dawn?
Elizabeth called out.
Stubbo?
There was no answer, save for the scuttling of a multitude of legs. In a whisper, she added,
Wil? Chrissy? Are you there?
We're here.
Wil whispered back.
Chrissy, can I get some light?
In answer, the fairy snapped her fingers, and a glowing orb appeared in the air above Elizabeth. Both fairies then screamed in horror at the sight around them. Spiders swarmed down tree trunks and gathered in a circle around Elizabeth, fangs twitching and rough voices whispering amongst themselves. The spiders were not as large as the ones Elizabeth remembered from the gorge. These ones only stood as high as Elizabeth's thighs, but that was large enough for her taste. For the time being, the light held them at bay, but it wouldn't be long before their eyes adjusted and they rushed in for the kill.
Pull yourselves together,
Elizabeth shouted.
Wil, what can you do with this?
As best as she could, with her bound arms, Elizabeth held up the rubber dagger she had taken from the fake Don.
Oh,
Wil exclaimed.
I know.
Wil fluttered out of Elizabeth's hair and darted down to her waist, tapping the rubber blade with one finger. It immediately hardened and lengthened into a longsword, drawing a frightened yelp from Elizabeth as it rushed towards her face, severing the webs that bound her and nearly skewering her chin. Elizabeth scrambled to her feet, taking the sword in both hands and pointing it straight ahead. She recalled Monster's lessons as she whirled about, sweeping the blade in all directions to hold the spiders at bay. Hundreds of eyes flashed reflections of the silver light. Hundreds of legs pulled away from Elizabeth as the frontmost spiders abruptly backed into their compatriots, making a sound not unlike wood clacking together. One spider crept forward, tentatively extending a limb in Elizabeth's direction. She immediately made an example of him. Her sword swept about in a shining silver arc, severing the tip of the spider's leg. It gave a shriek as it retreated, fluids oozing from the rigid shell. Others from the swarm crowded in around their wounded compatriot, forming a living shield. A more adventurous spider leapt at Elizabeth's back. Elizabeth spun about, the arcing blade cutting the spider cleanly in half. It squealed in shock and pain as its abdomen dropped to the ground behind it. The spider's limbs grew stiff and still, without its heart to pump blood through them. A guttural cry went up, and the spiders slowly backed away, retreating into the branches overhanging the path, for not one of them was willing to risk its life against such difficult prey.
Yeah,
Wil shouted at the retreating swarm.
you better run.
Hush!
Elizabeth muttered.
We still need to find the others.
Wil gulped, his face turning pale.
You want me to follow them?
No, of course not.
Elizabeth answered, and she set off for the trees at the path's edge.
I will. You stay in my hair where you'll be safe.
Wil obeyed, heaving a sigh of relief as he tucked himself behind a braid.
You're the boss.
Elizabeth smiled with a light chuckle.
Now, if I could have just gotten you to say that in the classroom.
Elizabeth followed the sounds of the fleeing swarm, picking her way through a narrow opening in the trees and clambering over low branches and across twisted trunks in pursuit. With the light of Chrissy's orb, Elizabeth could now pick out her footing far more effectively, and though she found herself confronted with many a tight squeeze, it was far easier to navigate the dense, three-dimensional maze that was the Blackwood. The vision vanished, the orb collapsing in on itself and falling to the floor in a hail of flaming shards as Thraxus clenched his fist. "What kind of princess knows how to fight?" the warlock grumbled. He raised a questioning eyebrow and smirked. "I believe I'm in love." The goblin squeezed back against Thraxus' throne, desperate to avoid notice. He failed beyond his darkest fears. "Mr. Nelson," Thraxus shouted as he hopped to his feet, "it would appear we have a battle to wage against time." "What are you thinking, boss?" the goblin squeaked. Thraxus answered with a sadistic gaze down at his terrified minion. The goblin gulped in terror. "Boss?" Thraxus grinned savagely. "I'm thinking. King Peter has been allowed to sit on his hands for too long. It's time he shared our schedule." "What are you gonna do?" Thraxus settled back into his throne, crossed his legs, and heaved a deep breath to focus his mind. "I'm going to put on a little performance for His Highness, and I believe you, Mr. Nelson, shall be the star." The goblin grimaced. "Why don't I like the sound of that?" "Because you're a wise man, for now." "I was afraid you'd say that." The warlock held out his hand, fingers tense and grasping, and immediately the goblin felt a painful tightness about his throat as he was lifted by the neck into the air and carried to the center of the chamber. With his free hand, Thraxus scratched his chin in thought. Where to begin? Such a delicate task. He grinned as he reached a decision. "The clothes. We don't want you in a state of undress, now do we?" No, the goblin gagged in agreement. In the blink of an eye, his ragged brown tunic was transformed into a scarlet dress. Boss, keep me away from the window, please. Not to worry, Thraxis answered. If anyone misunderstands, they won't for long. They won't? The warlock ignored his minion's question. First, a rubbery consistency, elastic so it can stretch. The goblin squeaked in discomfort as his dress grew uncomfortably tight. And now, Thraxis went on, now comes the fun part. The goblin cried out in pain as his bones snapped and lengthened, his joints popping and reshaping, and his flesh stretching and molding. Thraxis surveyed his work with satisfaction. The face needs a little work, but I do like the rest. Boss, the goblin whimpered. Then he cried out as his skull and throat twisted like putty. After another excruciating minute, the goblin was finally released and allowed to drop to the floor with a low thud. There he lay, coughing for breath and rubbing his neck. And back to silk. Thraxis waved his hand in the goblin's general direction. The dress went limp and loose, as had been the one worn by Elizabeth. Thraxis rose to his feet and sauntered down to the goblin's side. Excellent. A spectacular work of art, if I do say so myself.
What do you...
The goblin paused in silence. His voice had changed.
What?
He began slowly.
What did you do?
Though he felt his mouth moving, he heard a woman speaking. In answer, Thraxis held his hand, palm upwards, and another orb coalesced into being, floating just inches above. Inside there was an image of Elizabeth, looking back down at the goblin.
Hey!
He exclaimed, pointing up at the orb.
Isn't that...
But the goblin's voice faltered. For the moment he pointed up at the orb, the woman within pointed back at him. The goblin tentatively waved his hand back and forth. In the orb, Elizabeth's face paled as she mirrored the motion. I required a decoy, Thraxis explained. The orb vanished in a burst of flames as his fingers curled shut. I believe you'll do quite nicely.
So, what next, boss?
The fake Elizabeth asked. Next? Thraxis repeated absently. He drew an obsidian rod from within his robe and tapped it against his free palm. Next, I add a few finishing touches. The fake Elizabeth didn't like where this was going.
Well, boss, I'm pretty finished already, aren't I?
Oh, of course, Thraxis agreed, still tapping away. Very pretty, I assure you. But you see, the good king needs to think you're in peril. You can't look perfectly content, as if you've been sitting in the lap of luxury all this time. You've been a prisoner, locked away in my dungeons, and you know what happens in my dungeons. The fake Elizabeth nodded.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just head down there and let them work me over then.
Yet as she darted for the stairway, a multitude of obsidian rods crossed over the opening. She crashed into a solid floor. Thraxis shook his head. Now where's the fun in that? The rod swung to his side as he sauntered in the fake Elizabeth's direction. You know how I like to work with my own hands.
No, please, boss.
Fake Elizabeth pleaded, raising an arm to shield herself.
I'll beg. I'll grovel. I'll put on a show the king will never forget. I'll cry. I'll wail for help.
Thraxis stopped just inches from his minion and flipped the rod over in his hand. Yes, Mr. Nelson, you will. Then he swung the rod across fake Elizabeth's cheek, sending her crashing onto her side. It was nearly 3 hours later that the king's face appeared in a new orb, contorted into a look of abject horror as he laid eyes on the vision of his bruised, battered daughter.
Hey, Elizabeth!
King Peter whimpered, nearly in tears.
What has he...
I grew bored, Thraxis cut him off. The way you've been putting me off, I began to wonder if you really wanted her back. He roughly shoved fake Elizabeth towards the orb. Do you? Fake Elizabeth's cheeks ran with real tears as she cried out.
Please, Father, help me!
Yes, Father, Thraxis chimed in. Save her. Oh, wait, you've been trying, haven't you? That's why I've had to kill so many knights and princes lately, isn't it? The warlock clapped a hand against his cheek with a look of mock surprise. So that's why you've kept me waiting.
Father!
Fake Elizabeth wailed. Okay, that's enough now. Thraxis gave the imitation princess a rough shake by her arm. I believe he gets the point. Don't you, Your Highness? The king didn't immediately answer. Thraxis flashed a savage grin. Maybe you need a little demonstration?
No!
Oh, I think you do. Thraxis drew the obsidian rod once more. Especially after you missed all the fun last time. Fake Elizabeth screamed as Thraxis raised his arm. You monster! The king exclaimed. Well, now that would make two of us, wouldn't it? Fake Elizabeth wailed in time with a series of dull thuds. All right, the king cried out. Make your demands. Anything you want. Just don't hurt my daughter. Thraxis paused, tapping his bloody rod against his forehead in thought. Well, first I think I'd like to amuse myself a little. The screams resumed. Stop! The king begged. Please stop! Second, I want your crown. The screams grew louder, as did the sound of obsidian pounding against flesh. Third, your throne.
Father, help!
The chamber grew silent, save for the sound of Elizabeth's sobbing. The warlock's face came back into view as he leaned in close to the orb. I want your kingdom. King Peter gulped. The simple thought of Thraxis on the throne was enough to give him pause, captive daughter or no. What's the matter, Kingy Wingy? The warlock leered out of the orb. Is a lowly prisoner worth so little to you? King Peter shook his head. Very well. Bring her here, and I will personally... Oh, no, Thraxis chuckled. You're coming here. I'm not about to walk into an ambush. The king nodded. I'll be there. Soon. For a moment, the mirth faded from Thraxis' expression, and his voice took on a tone of deathly gravity. This time, don't keep me waiting. You don't want me to get bored again. The orb burst into a rush of flame, leaving King Peter in utter silence. The setting sun shone through a high window, down the columned hall of his throne room. But for all the size and grandeur, he may as well have been no more than a mouse, huddled over a last crumb of cheese. Peter pressed his fist against his mouth to stifle his sobs. He was a tall, proud man, a veteran of many a crusade, a defender of his faith and of his country. But against Thraxis' sorcery he was utterly helpless. All he could do was pray, and hope that the hand of God was greater than the warlock's dark powers. Fear not, a low voice spoke up. A gentle, golden glow fell across the king's face, one nod of the sun. Peter looked up to see a new orb in place of the old. You again? It is I. Listen to me, your highness. Do not believe what you are shown. That was not your daughter. The king fought to hold back his tears as he leaned back, exhausted, in his throne. I saw her, Ganulf. There is no other like her. I have also seen her, the orb answered. She runs free even now. She is protected by powerful magic. Yours? Fairies. They accompany her as she rushes to rescue a good knight. Fairies. They accompany her as she rushes to rescue a good knight. Soon she will find my home. Peter was silent for a time. How can I be sure? Thraxis is a liar. You can be sure of nothing he says. Peter eyed the orb for a time. Thraxis wants my kingdom. What do you want? Your friendship, the orb answered simply. Then it faded away. Peter surveyed his empty throne room and heaved a sigh. Smoke and mirrors, lies and deception. What was he to believe? Peter gazed up to the window high above at the far end of the hall. The light of the sun grew dim, turning the sky red as it drifted to the horizon. All across the countryside, shadows grew long and grim, like the black smoke that shrouded Peter's heart. But in the Blackwood there were no shadows to grow, save those cast outwards from Elizabeth's feet by a bright orb that floated above her head. She shed a tear for the helpless king. A moment later she blinked it away. Now was the time for action. The realm of spiders stretched out before her, a broad, dark clearing, glowing a dark blue in the orb's light, the ground dotted with toxic puddles of saliva that had long since turned the ground against even the cursed plants that grew in the Blackwood. Elizabeth could hear the rapid scuttling of their legs in the branches overhead. Yes, even here the Blackwood blotted out the sky. The stench of rot and sulfuric fumes hung heavy in the air. Elizabeth had to step carefully, picking her way around steaming, acidic bogs. Ragged, torn cocoons hung from the branches overhead, bits of bone and leathery skin hanging free from the desiccated remains of the spider's previous victims. Wil gulped as he watched the bleak landscape drift past.
This doesn't look promising.
Hush!
Elizabeth whispered back.
Keep up hope. Just tell yourself the others are alive and well, and we will find them, alive and well.
Chrissy gasped as she caught sight of hundreds of eyes staring down from above.
They know we're here.
Elizabeth ran a finger through her hair, gently rubbing the fairy's shoulder.
Don't be afraid.
That, however, was easier said than done. All around the clearing, spiders were dropping down from the branches, gathering in a massive swarm behind Elizabeth, yet none made a move for her. Steam issued from the caustic pools as the ebony legs churned through them, leaving sizzling trails in the spiders' wakes. As one body, the swarm crept forward, in a vast black wake at Elizabeth's heels. Elizabeth held her sword in both hands and took a deep breath to steady her nerves.
Don't be afraid.
She repeated to herself.
Don't be afraid.
Ahead, a lone spider dropped onto a low hillock, its iridescent indigo carapace shining in the orb's light, and turned towards a dark hollow that yawned ahead. The spider's four forelimbs raised and spread before it in a gesture of what appeared to be reverence. Overhead, Elizabeth could make out the forms of two fresh cocoons, one considerably smaller than the other. The indigo spider made a low, coughing sound, as if clearing its throat. Then it spoke, or perhaps chanted. The simple fact that it could form intelligible words was a wonder.
Father of thousands, we bring gifts.
Elizabeth felt a light nudge at her legs as a spider came up from behind and prodded her forward.
Father of thousands,
the indigo spider called out.
Come forth. We call to you, Father. Graciously accept this offering.
A single limb stretched down from the branches and plucked a pair of ropes loose, sending the cocoons crashing to the ground. Elizabeth caught wind of two faint groans as the cocoons landed.
They're alive.
Elizabeth sighed.
They're still alive.
But even as she said it, Elizabeth felt her stomach tie itself into uncertain knots. The spider behind Elizabeth gave her another nudge, urging her into motion. It made a low, guttural sound, a scratchy, gurgling vocalization, which only another spider could have understood.
Father of thousands,
the indigo spider shouted.
The lost one has been reclaimed. Come for her, Father.
There was a low rumble. Beyond the hillock, in the dark hollow, something enormous stirred. Giant, hairy limbs rose into view, followed by a brown, flattened shape, from which a multitude of black eyes stared outward. The indigo spider scurried aside, making way for the giant. Higher and higher it rose, sprawling legs carrying it far above the others. It surveyed the offerings before it, and then zeroed in on Elizabeth's form. Elizabeth blinked. She knew that voice.
Matrix!
Uh-huh!
You're the father of thousands?
The gargantuan spider lifted a pair of forelimbs and tapped them against each of his fangs. Mwah! Mwah! Elizabeth grinned.
Peter did say you were quite the ladies' man.
Uh-huh! Uh-huh!
What are you doing?
Chrissy whispered in a panic.
He's a friend.
Elizabeth muttered back.
You're friends with a spider and the monster?
Wil exclaimed. Elizabeth nodded gently. The fairies stared at each other, mouths agape.
Cool!
So,
Elizabeth went on, lowering her sword.
this should simplify everything.
Huh? The father of thousands tilted his head to one side.
You can let us go.
Elizabeth exclaimed tentatively.
You wouldn't eat me or stew, would ya?
Uh-uh.
So I'll just cut them free and we'll be on our way.
Yet, as Elizabeth took a step towards the cocoons, a giant, hairy limb stabbed into the ground before her, and the father of thousands tilted himself back and forth, as if shaking his head. Elizabeth set her fists against her hips.
What do you mean?
The father of thousands gestured behind him, and held a limb up to his fangs. Shh! Elizabeth peered between the great spider's legs, eyes straining as she gazed into the darkness beyond.
Is there something you're afraid of?
Uh-huh,
And you don't want to anger it?
Elizabeth guessed. She crossed her arms and smirked up at the huge spider.
Now what on earth could the father of thousands be afraid of?
As if in answer, there came a sound of angry jabbering out of the abyss, and a set of legs, even longer than the fathers of thousands, rose up behind him.
The mother of thousands.
Elizabeth guessed.
Of course.
And a terrifying sight she was, wearing the crabbiest expression a spider could wear, hair bundled up in curlers, fangs painted a bright red, and carrying a giant spider-sized rolling pin, which she brandished over her head. "Oh," the father of thousands groaned as he approached his gargantuan mate, head bowed in submission. He tried to calm her, caressing her flanks with his forelimbs. His wife, however, was having none of it. The rolling pin came down on the father of thousands' head, sending him shuddering to the ground. "Yipe!" More angry jabbering chattered from the mother's throat as she clobbered her husband a second time.
What's going on?
Chrissy whispered.
If I had to guess,
Elizabeth mused.
I'd say his wife's angry that dinner's late.
Maybe she's telling him not to play with his food.
Wil suggested. Elizabeth shrugged.
I could believe that.
Amid the distraction, Elizabeth crept forward, drawing a great row of chattering protest from among the spiders at her back. Yet not one dared to approach, the two struggling behemoths at the center of the clearing. Elizabeth had to duck and weave her way forward, dodging giant spider legs as the mother of thousands pursued her henpecked husband, while simultaneously avoiding the venomous pools in the ground. It took some doing, but Elizabeth managed to make her way to the cocoons. With the warring giants at her back, she was free to draw her sword and cut open the first cocoon. From the head down to the shoulders, it was nothing but bundles of silk padding. It wasn't until Elizabeth reached where the ribs should have been that she saw the first curly tuft of hair.
Stubbo?
Elizabeth exclaimed.
You know,
The little man mused.
if it weren't for the whole spider food thing, that cocoon would have been real comfy. All nice and roomy, you know.
Then that must mean...
Elizabeth raised an eyebrow in disbelief as she glanced to the smaller cocoon. As she cut it open, she found Don scrunched up inside, arms folded close and his neck bent at an uncomfortable angle.
All right, who's the genius that paired us with these bags? I want to file a complaint.
I don't think that'll be necessary.
Elizabeth remarked as she pulled Don to his feet.
I don't plan to stay that long.
Ow!
Stubbo winced as Wil and Chrissy pulled him free by his ears.
Watch the lobes. Those things are sensitive, kids.
Sorry, Chrissy eagerly apologized. She then let go and grabbed Stubbo by the nose instead.
Ow! Wow, 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 wow!
That's enough, you two.
Elizabeth interjected.
I'll deal with this.
Will shrugged.
Whatever you say, Miss Hartley.
And with that, both fairies let Stubbo drop with a low thud and a high groan.
Deal with it quick.
Don added, drawing a pair of daggers.
The spiders are regrouping.
Indeed they were. As the mother and father of thousands crashed about, their children scattered before them, scuttling in a great black mass all around the clearing, and a number of them had taken notice of their escaped victims.
Which way now?
Elizabeth asked. Don shrugged.
No idea. I lost my bearings when they carried me off.
Stubbo drew his sword, but as he gazed around the clearing, he gulped in despair.
Well, it was nice knowing y'all. Bye!
With that, he slipped a small golden ring on his finger and vanished from sight.
Stubbo!
Elizabeth exclaimed. She rolled her eyes and sighed in disgust.
Well, that's one of us down.
This way! Elizabeth glanced to Don.
Which way?
Don gave her a curious look.
I didn't say anything.
But I did. Elizabeth scanned the ground for Stubbo.
You know, it'd be a lot easier to follow you if I could see you.
Stubbo reappeared for just a moment.
I didn't say nothing neither.
Then he was gone again. This way, Lady Elizabeth! A voice of immense power boomed. At the far side of the clearing, an orb of blinding brilliance flashed into being. Every spider was still, even the two giants. Gazing upon the orb, they all spoke with one united tone. Elizabeth glanced to Don.
Should we?
Of course we should.
Stubbo piped up.
I know that voice, and he owes me big time.
As the five companions fled after the orb, there came a great sound of crashing and a rush of legs behind them, as the father of thousands squealed aloud in hot pursuit. Or perhaps he too was fleeing for his life, for his wife was also giving chase and brandishing her rolling pin. As Don and Elizabeth slipped through a narrow opening in the trees, there came a loud crash behind them. The father of thousands was just a little too wide to fit through the gap, and came to a smashing halt as the blackwood closed in before him. The great spider cried out. Elizabeth paused for a time, gazing back at the struggling father of thousands. Whatever he may have done, he was still good old Matrix, and there was a plaintive tone to his squeals. Behind him, Elizabeth could see the looming form of a rolling pin raised in the air.
Help me!
Elizabeth gasped. Don grunted.
Help you what?
He's saying help me!
Elizabeth exclaimed. She glanced back towards Don, a familiar gleam in her eye.
No.
Don blurted out.
First you want to save a boogeyman, then you want me to save a spider? No, Elizabeth. No. No, Liz, we just escaped a moment ago. I am not going back there.
And I didn't ask you to.
Elizabeth retorted. Don cringed.
Well, not in so many words, no.
Elizabeth drew her sword, its steel flashing in the dim light.
Whoa, be careful with that.
Matrix is like family,
Elizabeth explained.
I'm going back for him.
Not without me, you aren't.
Don shouted, rushing after her. Back in the clearing, 8 scars had been torn into the ground, slowly filling with venomous drippings from the shrieking fathers of thousands' fangs, as his wife dragged him backwards by his abdomen. Elizabeth charged between the father's legs, blade held low, intent on the far larger mother of thousands. The giant female had seized her mate with her frontmost limbs, a pair of smaller limbs alongside her mouth, and then dug in with her fangs. When Elizabeth struck, it was not to injure but to shock. She grazed the bottom of the mother's abdomen with just the tip of her blade. Elizabeth neither drew blood nor pierced the great spider's armor, but the cut was just painful enough for a distraction, not unlike ramming one's side against the corner of a table. The mother of thousands let out a shriek, releasing her captive mate, and spun about in search of her attacker. Elizabeth dodged and weaved among the churning forest of limbs, but wasn't quite fast enough. A great chitin leg slammed against the edge of the blade, sending it flying from Elizabeth's grip. The weapon landed in a stray puddle, steam issuing from the surface as the metal rapidly corroded and was eaten away to nothing. Elizabeth, for her part, stumbled from the sheer force of the impact and fell to her knees, hands plunging into the muddy ground just inches from another of the caustic pools. Venom rushed into new grooves, steaming as it made contact with flesh. Elizabeth let out a scream, recoiling from the puddle, her skin burning from the acid. Her cries did not go unnoticed. 8 black, glistening eyes zeroed in on Elizabeth's huddled form as the Mother of Thousands swung about, her giant fangs extended, rising with her forelimbs as she shrieked in fury. A hot, humid wind blasted from the great spider's throat, sending flecks of spit pelting across Elizabeth's face. But before the Mother of Thousands could finish off Elizabeth, there arose 2 pairs of hairy chitin limbs behind her, and there came a high, throaty roar. Rawr! Rawr! In a flurry of limbs and bristles, the Father of Thousands leapt upon his gargantuan wife's back, covering her eyes with his frontmost legs and holding on for dear life with the other 6. With a panicked shriek, the Mother of Thousands lurched away, spinning, circling, legs flying, as she fought to throw off her attacker. Amid that storm of limbs, Dawn arrived.
"Ah, Liz,"
he muttered, looking down at her curled, seared hands. Shaking his head, he took her by the wrists and hauled Elizabeth to her feet.
"Let's get you out of here. Then we can take care of those. All right?"
Elizabeth managed a faint nod.
"Will?"
Dawn added.
"See if you can widen that gap in the trees, okay?"
The fairy poked his head out of Elizabeth's hair, an eyebrow raised in curiosity.
"For her spineless friend,"
Dawn explained, nodding towards the quarreling spiders.
Are you sure?
Wil asked.
"Positive."
Dawn answered. Wil flew on ahead, doing as asked despite his misgivings. He tapped several trees along their trunks. In answer, they bent outwards, forming a passage just wide enough for the Father of Thousands to fit through. Shortly afterwards, Elizabeth and Dawn came rushing through that same opening. Far behind them, there came a faint cry of, "Wait for me!" For a moment, Elizabeth forgot her pain as she glanced over her shoulder in amazement.
He talked! I can't believe it!
There came a rush of legs. The Father of Thousands paused just a moment at the entrance to wave back at his irate wife. "Bye-bye!" Then he scuttled through, snickering as he heard the sound of a terrible crash in his wake. Dawn shot a glance over his shoulder in the Father of Thousands' general direction, brow furrowing.
"Any pursuit?"
The Father of Thousands shrugged. Dawn turned his attention to Elizabeth's hands. They looked as if she'd stuck them in a fire.
"I don't like the look of those burns. Here, hold your hands out, like so."
Next, Dawn took a canteen from where it hung at his belt.
"This may hurt a bit."
Yet as Dawn washed off Elizabeth's hands, she didn't even flinch. She actually appeared remarkably content. Dawn gave her an uncomfortable smirk.
"Well, what are you smiling at?"
You,
Elizabeth answered.
my brave knight.
Dawn grunted.
"Well, your brave knight is fresh out of bandages. You'll have to be careful with those hands for a while."
The Father of Thousands exclaimed, scuttling forward. Dawn instinctively drew a dagger.
"Hey, what the—"
It's okay.
Elizabeth assured him.
I've seen Matrix do this before.
Dawn watched in amazement as the giant spider wove out a broad, thin strip of silk and proceeded to wrap it around Elizabeth's hands. When at last the Father of Thousands was finished, he stepped back with a high squeak of, "Ta-da!" Dawn muttered.
He wouldn't be house-trained, would he?
Uh-huh. Elizabeth nodded back at Dawn. Dawn shook his head with a sigh.
And you can admire him later.
Elizabeth added.
For now, we need to be on our way.
With that, Elizabeth led off, Stubbo hot on her heels. There was no time for Dawn to think, for the Father of Thousands was already scurrying forward, and there was no space at the great spider's sides. So Dawn set off again, silently marveling at his suddenly expanded crew.
Feels like something out of The Wizard of Oz.